The macabre history of the DawsonsA cult forced them to raise 11 kids in complete isolation deep in the temperate rainforests of northwestern Washington state, where ancient Douglas firs tower like cathedral spires and morning mists shroud the forest floor in perpetual twilight. There exists a place that maps forgot and civilization never touched. It is here, 27 miles from the nearest road, and accessible only by a treacherous network of overgrown logging trails, that the Dawson family compound stood for 32 years, a cluster of ramshackle buildings that housed one of the most disturbing stories of religious extremism and child abuse in American history. The compound's isolation was not accidental. When Thomas and Rebecca Dawson first arrived in this remote corner of the Olympic Peninsula in 1979, they were not seeking the peace and tranquility that draws most people to the wilderness. They were running not from the law, but from what they believed was a corrupted world destined for divine destruction. More importantly, they were following the explicit instructions of a man they called the Prophet, the enigmatic leader of a religious sect known only to its members as the Eternal Covenant. The Eternal Covenant was unlike the more publicized cults that captured media attention in the 1970s and 1980s. It operated in absolute secrecy, with no public presence, no recruitment drives, no attempts to gain converts from the general population. Instead, it functioned as a network of isolated families scattered across the remote regions of the American West, each group living in complete separation from the outside world while following the increasingly bizarre and dangerous dictates of their unseen leader, Thomas Dawson, a former electronics engineer from Seattle, and his wife Rebecca, a kindergarten teacher turned devoted follower, had been members of the Eternal Covenant for 3 years when they received their instructions to establish what the Prophet called a breeding sanctuary deep in the Washington wilderness. The purpose of this sanctuary, as explained in the carefully coded letters that served as the cult's primary means of communication, was to raise a generation of children completely isolated from the contamination of modern society, children who would serve a special purpose in the coming apocalypse. The compound that Thomas constructed over the following months reflected both his engineering background and the specific requirements outlined in the Prophet's instructions. The main dwelling was a large, windowless structure built from local timber and designed to house multiple families. Surrounding this central building were smaller cabins, workshops, storage facilities, and most ominously, a series of underground chambers that Thomas was instructed to construct but never told the purpose of. The Dawsons were not alone in their wilderness exile. Over the first 2 years, they were joined by 3 other families, the Hendricks, the Novaks, and the Stones, each bringing their own children and their own absolute devotion to the Prophet's vision. Together, these 4 families created a community of 23 adults and children, completely cut off from the outside world and dedicated to following the increasingly disturbing instructions that arrived via mysterious messengers who appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly. The children born and raised in this isolated compound knew nothing of the world beyond the forest. They had never seen a television, never heard a radio, never met anyone who was not part of their sealed community. Their education consisted entirely of religious instruction based on the Prophet's teachings, which portrayed the outside world as a realm of evil and corruption where Satan's influence had corrupted all human institutions. By 1985, the compound housed 11 children ranging in age from infants to teenagers. These children, Sarah, Matthew, Joshua, Hannah, Caleb, Ruth, Samuel, Rebecca, Daniel, Miriam, and Isaac, presented the second generation of the Eternal Covenant. Raised from birth to serve purposes they could not understand and prepared for, a destiny that would have horrified anyone with knowledge of the Prophet's true intentions. The daily life of the compound was rigidly structured. According to the Prophet's detailed instructions, the families rose before dawn for group prayer, sessions that could last for hours, The children were separated by age and gender for their religious education, which involved memorizing lengthy passages from the prophet's writings and participating in ritualistic ceremonies that grew increasingly bizarre and disturbing as the years passed. The adults maintained the compound's isolation through a combination of careful planning and paranoid vigilance. They grew their own food using techniques specified in the prophet's agricultural manuals, preserved meat from animals they hunted in the surrounding forests, and manufactured their own clothing and tools according to traditional methods that would leave no technological footprint. Mail was received through a complex system of intermediaries that ensured no direct connection could be traced between the compound and the outside world. Perhaps most disturbing was the complete absence of medical care available to the children. The prophet taught that illness and injury were signs of spiritual weakness that could only be cured through prayer and adherence to his teachings. When children became sick, they were subjected to increasingly harsh purification rituals rather than receiving proper medical treatment. Several children died during these rituals, their deaths explained as God's will, and their bodies buried in unmarked graves within the compound's boundaries. The isolation of the compound was so complete that the children had no concept of normal human society or their rights as individuals. They believed that the compound represented the entire world of righteous people, and that beyond the forest lay only the realm of the damned. They were taught that questioning the prophet's instructions or expressing curiosity about the outside world were mortal sins that would result in eternal damnation. As the children grew older, their roles within the compound became more defined and more troubling. The teenage boys were trained as guardians responsible for maintaining the compound's security and ensuring that no one could enter or leave without permission. The teenage girls were prepared for their roles as vessels, though the specific nature of these roles was kept secret from them until they reached what the prophet determined was the appropriate age. The compound's isolation was maintained not just through physical barriers, but through psychological conditioning that made escape unthinkable. The children were taught that the outside world was populated by demons in human form who would torture and kill anyone who left the safety of the compound. They were told that the air beyond the forest was poisoned, that the water was contaminated, and that even brief exposure to the outside world would result in madness and death. The first crack in this carefully constructed isolation came in 1995, when 14-year-old Matthew Dawson discovered an abandoned ranger station while hunting in the forest. Inside the station, he found magazines, maps, and equipment that contradicted everything he had been taught about the outside world. The discovery filled him with questions that he was too terrified to voice, but it also planted the first seeds of doubt about the prophet's teachings. Matthew's discovery remained secret for 2 years, during which time he made repeated clandestine visits to the ranger station, gradually piecing together evidence that the outside world was not the hellscape he had been taught to believe. He learned about cities, schools, hospitals, and technologies that seemed miraculous compared to the primitive conditions of the compound. Most importantly, he learned that there were people in the outside world who helped children in danger, a concept that was completely foreign to his sheltered existence. The psychological pressure of maintaining this secret while continuing to participate in the compound's daily rituals began to take its toll on Matthew. His behavior became increasingly erratic, drawing the attention of the adult leaders who interpreted his distress as evidence of spiritual corruption. The purification rituals that followed were more severe than anything Matthew had previously experienced, involving prolonged isolation, fasting, and physical punishments that pushed him to the brink of psychological collapse. It was during one of these purification sessions that Matthew made a decision that would ultimately lead to the discovery of the compound and the rescue of its surviving children. Unable to endure the psychological torture any longer, he broke one of the prophet's most fundamental rules and spoke openly about his discovery of the ranger station and his growing doubts about their isolated existence. The reaction from the adult leaders was swift and terrifying. Matthew was declared a vessel of corruption and subjected to the most extreme purification ritual the compound had ever witnessed. For 3 days, he was kept in one of the underground chambers, deprived of food and water, while the adults performed ceremonies intended to drive the demons from his soul. By the 3rd day, it was clear that Matthew was dying, his body unable to survive the combination of physical deprivation and psychological trauma. It was then that Sarah Dawson, Matthew's older sister and the eldest of the compound's children, made a decision that would save not just her brother's life, but the lives of all the surviving children, despite 19 years of conditioning that made the very thought of leaving the compound seem like spiritual suicide. Sarah gathered 3 of the other older children and escaped into the forest, determined to find help for Matthew before it was too late. The journey that followed was a nightmare of fear, confusion, and physical hardship for children who had never traveled more than a mile from their homes. They had no maps, no survival skills appropriate for the deep wilderness, and no clear understanding of how to find civilization. They knew only that they had to keep moving, following what they hoped were the right directions, based on Matthew's descriptions of the abandoned ranger station. For 6 days, the 4 children stumbled through the dense forest, surviving on berries and stream water while avoiding the search parties. They could hear calling their names through the trees. They were weakened by hunger and exhaustion when they finally encountered a team of actual park rangers, conducting a routine patrol in an area that was supposed to be uninhabited. The rangers' discovery of 4 malnourished, terrified children in the middle of one of the most remote wilderness areas in the Pacific Northwest triggered one of the largest search and rescue operations in Washington state history. The children's initial accounts of a hidden compound housing dozens of people seemed so fantastical that some officials suspected they were dealing with either a hoax or children suffering from severe psychological trauma. But as the children provided increasingly detailed and consistent descriptions of their isolated community, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Olympic Peninsula, a group of religious extremists had been operating a compound for over 15 years, raising children in complete isolation from civilization and subjecting them to what could only be described as systematic abuse. The search for the compound would prove to be one of the most challenging rescue operations ever undertaken in the region, complicated by the children's limited understanding of geography and their terror at the thought of leading authorities back to the only home they had ever known. As helicopters began circling the forest and search teams prepared to venture into the wilderness, the stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the full horror of what had been happening in the darkness of the deep woods. The rescue operation that followed Sarah Dawson's desperate escape became a race against time that would expose one of the most disturbing religious conspiracies in American history. When law enforcement and child protective services finally located the compound after 4 days of intensive searching, what they discovered defied comprehension and challenged every assumption about the limits of human cruelty disguised as religious devotion. The compound itself appeared even more primitive and isolated than the escaped children had described. The main building was a windowless structure that resembled a prison more than a home, with thick timber walls that blocked out natural light and heavy doors that could be barred from the outside. The surrounding cabins were a little more than shacks, lacking basic amenities like running water or electricity. But it was the underground chambers that revealed the true horror of what had been taking place in this remote wilderness sanctuary. The chambers, constructed according to the prophet's detailed specifications, were not storage areas or root cellars, as Thomas Dawson had been told during their construction. Instead, they were elaborate ritual spaces designed for ceremonies that combined religious extremism with systematic child abuse. The walls were covered with symbols and writings that investigators would later identify as a corrupted amalgamation of various religious and occult traditions, twisted into a belief system that justified the most heinous acts as divine commandments. When authorities breached the compound, They found Matthew Dawson barely alive in one of these underground chambers, his body ravaged by 3 weeks of purification rituals that had brought him to the brink of death. The other children were discovered in various states of physical and psychological distress, their health compromised by years of inadequate nutrition, lack of medical care, and exposure to traumatic religious ceremonies that had shaped their entire understanding of reality. The adults of the compound initially attempted to resist the rescue operation, claiming that the authorities were agents of Satan sent to corrupt their righteous community. Thomas and Rebecca Dawson, along with the other adult members, had to be forcibly removed from the premises as they called upon the prophet to send divine intervention to protect their isolated sanctuary. But the most shocking discovery came when investigators began examining the correspondence and documentation found throughout the compound. The letters from the prophet, which had guided every aspect of the community's existence for over 15 years, revealed the true purpose behind the isolation and the horrific destiny that had been planned for the children. The prophet, whose real identity investigators would eventually uncover, was not a religious visionary but a sophisticated criminal who had created the Eternal Covenant as an elaborate system for producing and trafficking children for ritualistic abuse. The isolated compounds scattered across the American West were not religious communities, but breeding facilities designed to raise children completely cut off from society, making them perfect victims for a network of wealthy individuals who paid enormous sums to participate in elaborate ceremonial abuse. The correspondence revealed that the Dawson compound had been preparing for what the prophet called the Great Offering, a series of ritualistic ceremonies scheduled to begin when the children reached what he considered optimal ages for sacrifice. The underground chambers had been constructed as venues for these ceremonies, which would have involved the systematic torture and murder of all 11 children as part of elaborate rituals designed to satisfy the perverted desires of the prophet's wealthy clientele. The timing of Sarah Dawson's escape had been crucial, according to the prophet's correspondence. The Great Offering had been scheduled to begin within 6 months of the compound's discovery. The children had been unknowingly living their final months of life when Matthew's discovery of the Ranger station set in motion the chain of events that ultimately saved them. The investigation that followed the compound's discovery revealed that the Eternal Covenant was far more extensive and organized than anyone had initially suspected. The network included 7 other compounds in remote areas of Montana, Idaho, Colorado, Utah, and Northern California, each housing families who believed they were participating in a righteous religious movement while actually serving as unwitting facilitators of systematic child abuse. The prophet himself was identified as Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a former child psychologist who had lost his license to practice in 1976, following allegations of inappropriate conduct with young patients, rather than facing accountability for his crimes. Whitfield had disappeared from civilization and spent 3 years developing the elaborate theological framework that would become the Eternal Covenant's belief system. Whitfield's genius lay in his understanding of how to manipulate religious devotion to serve his criminal purposes. He had carefully studied successful cult leaders and religious movements, identifying the psychological techniques that could be used to inspire absolute obedience in followers who believed they were serving God rather than facilitating evil. The families who joined the Eternal Covenant genuinely believed they were protecting their children from a corrupt world, never realizing they were actually preparing them for systematic victimization. The compound's discovery triggered simultaneous raids on the other Eternal Covenant facilities, resulting in the rescue of 63 children and the arrest of dozens of adults who had been living in similar isolation. The investigation also uncovered a network of wealthy individuals who had been paying substantial sums to participate in the prophet's ceremonial abuse rituals, including prominent businessmen, politicians, and even religious leaders who had used their public reputations to conceal their participation in these horrific crimes. The children rescued from the compounds faced enormous challenges in adapting to the outside world they had been taught to fear. Many had never seen electric lights, automobiles, or any of the basic technologies that most people take for granted. They had no understanding of modern social structures, no concept of individual rights, and no experience with relationships outside their isolated communities. The Dawson children, in particular, struggled with the psychological trauma of learning that their entire understanding of reality had been built on lies, designed to facilitate their eventual victimization, the discovery that their parents had unknowingly been preparing them for ritual sacrifice created a complex mixture of betrayal, grief, and survivor's guilt that would require years of specialized therapy to address. Sarah Dawson, whose courage in escaping the compound had saved not just her brother, but dozens of other children, found herself grappling with the knowledge that her decision to flee had also destroyed the only family structure she had ever known. Her parents, Thomas and Rebecca, were arrested as accessories to the conspiracy, despite evidence suggesting they had been as thoroughly manipulated by the prophet as their children had been. The trial of Dr. Marcus Whitfield became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings of the decade, as prosecutors worked to unravel the full extent of his criminal network and hold accountable all those who had participated in or facilitated his crimes. The evidence presented during the trial revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation that had convinced devoted parents to unknowingly participate in preparing their children for systematic abuse. Whitfield himself showed no remorse during his trial, maintaining that his actions had been divinely inspired and that the rescued children had been denied their sacred destiny. His testimony provided chilling insights into the mindset of someone who could convince himself that the most heinous crimes were acts of religious devotion, and who could manipulate others into serving his purposes while believing they were protecting their children. The compound in the Washington wilderness was eventually destroyed by federal authorities, but not before investigators had documented every aspect of its construction and operation as evidence for the ongoing prosecutions. The site was declared a crime scene memorial, and efforts were made to identify and properly bury the children who had died during the compound's years of operation. The surviving children were placed in specialized foster care programs designed to help them adapt to life in the outside world while receiving the intensive psychological support they needed to process their traumatic experiences. Many struggled with basic social skills and educational deficits that resulted from their years of isolation, but their resilience and determination to build new lives provided hope for their eventual recovery. Matthew Dawson, whose near-death experience in the purification chamber had catalyzed the events leading to the compound's discovery, required months of medical treatment to recover from the physical damage inflicted during his ritualistic torture. His psychological recovery was even more challenging, as he grappled with guilt over his role in exposing the community that had been his family, even though that exposure had saved his life and the lives of his siblings. The investigation into the Eternal Covenant ultimately led to the prosecution of over 200 individuals who had participated in or facilitated the network's crimes. The case established important legal precedents for prosecuting religious extremism that involves child abuse, and helped law enforcement agencies develop better protocols for identifying and investigating isolated religious communities that might be concealing criminal activity. The macabre history of the Dawsons serves as a stark reminder of how religious manipulation can be used to facilitate the most horrific crimes against children. The compound in the Washington woods was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a systematic conspiracy that exploited parental love and religious devotion to create victims for ritualistic abuse. The story also highlights the extraordinary courage of children who find the strength to resist systematic conditioning and seek help despite having no understanding of the outside world. Sarah Dawson's decision to flee into the unknown forest with her dying brother represents one of the most remarkable acts of heroism in the annals of child rescue, a testament to the human spirit's ability to recognize evil even when it has been disguised as righteousness. The children of the eternal covenant, who survived their ordeal, have grown into adults who serve as powerful advocates for child protection and cult awareness. Their experiences provide crucial insights into how religious extremism can be used to facilitate abuse and how society can better protect vulnerable children from those who would exploit their innocence in the name of twisted religious beliefs. The prophet's true purpose was not religious enlightenment, but systematic victimization. And the compound in the woods was not a sanctuary but a prison designed to prepare innocent children for unthinkable horrors. The discovery of this truth came just in time to save 11 young lives and expose a criminal network that had operated in the shadows for decades, proving that even in the darkest isolation, hope can survive, and heroes can emerge to bring evil into the light.
Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret, and tonight you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious,